Welcome. You're welcome. I'm glad you're here. Yeah, so I think if I'm not mistaken, this might be your first time. So if you have any questions, I'm glad you found the chat there. Feel free to write them and I'll read your question aloud anonymously. I'll give a response. And then if you would prefer to use your voice, if you have like a headset or a microphone, you're welcome to do that. Just please keep in mind that your voice will be on the YouTube recording afterward. Okay. My questions seem to surround preparation for a court-ordered mediation in a divorce proceeding with the NPD that is asking 75 grand on a bogus claim. I keep getting the flashback thing going on, even though I'm pretty confident I will win the case. I just don't want to be getting defensive during the proceeding and trial to come, if this makes any sense. Yeah, totally. Because that is where they get you, in the self-defense. And in this book by Dr. George Simon, In Sheep's Clothing, he talks about that, Dr. George Simon, the different tactics that they use and how these covert aggressive tactics are used to get you to get on the defense. Because if you're busy defending yourself, then, anything could be happening. Like the abuse is taking place, the manipulation is happening because all of your energy could be focused on the self-defense. So you're exactly right about that. You don't want to get caught in the self-defense. And that's the hardest part, right? Because they push and provoke you, to the point where you want to defend yourself. So, one of the keys is going in there, depersonalizing it. Imagine like you're observing it. Imagine that you're not actually the defendant or the other person, in this case, that maybe you're like the attorney watching the situation, or you're just some outside observer with a lot of knowledge about the personality disorder that this person has, and watching the manipulation and calling it out for what it is instead of defending, So just keep coming back to the behavior, the problem, the issue at hand, and don't get distracted in any kind of self-defense. As soon as you catch yourself defending yourself, that's when you got to get yourself right again. And remember, it's not about you. It's not about defending yourself. It's about noticing the tactics, the aggressive manipulation tactics that are happening, calling them out, and not playing it, not enabling it. Because when we become self-defensive, which is our first reaction, right? Like somebody starts attacking your character, and what do you want to do but defend yourself? But that gets us into big trouble with these kinds of aggressors, these manipulators. And the craziest thing is that, normal rules of human engagement do not apply to these people. Dr. George Simon calls them character disturbances. The DSM calls it personality disorders. He just makes it really simple. Manipulators in general, they may or may not be narcissists or psychopaths or borderlines, whatever, but character disturbed, meaning they don't follow the standards of behavior that we accept as civil in our society. Things that we accept that we do to one another, they don't follow those rules. They believe they're exempt from those rules. They feel entitled to be exempt from those rules, and they will always twist and turn and manipulate to try to get their own advantage, to win, and to beat other people. So if we approach them like a normal human, that's where we get into trouble. And so I think you're right on there, where you're realizing that, you just don't want to get defensive during what's going on. And that's going to be really hard. It's definitely easier said than done. I would encourage you to remember your breath, to breathe, right? So say this person says something, before you respond, breathe, take 3 deep breaths, but like really take them, like allow for that space to breathe, because those 3 breaths can help bring you back to center, can help ground you, from getting pulled over into what's going on, or from, immediately reacting in a way that later you might regret having reacted that way. So taking 3 deep breaths and responding in a way that is, depersonalizing the abuse, making it outside yourself. It's not about you. I wish you a lot of luck. That sounds like quite a challenge. When is this coming up? Did you say here? Is this coming up pretty soon, your court case? Within a month. Okay. Okay. So that's good. You've probably been stressing a lot about this, spending a lot of mental, emotional energy on this for a while. I would be, but this is good within a month. And then, you can move past this. So use this time to train, like as if you were training for like a marathon, but it's like a psycho-spiritual marathon, what's going to be going on, and just get yourself right. I would get this book if I were you. You have some time, you live in USA, you can get it on Amazon pretty quickly, in sheep's clothing. I would get that book. I'm going to be interviewing Dr. George Simon this week. I'll do a video interview. I'll post that later. You should get some great insight from that too. But just the more aware you are of the tactics, the easier it is. The easier it is to depersonalize when you can see the pattern. Oh, that's evasion, that's, gaslighting, that's, blaming, whatever it is, so that it just becomes like this very almost like sterile, scientific sort of thing, instead of being such a personal, emotional, triggering sort of event. So really, really glad that you're already aware that you don't want to be caught in the defensive. That's really the key when approaching these sorts of situations. And, also keeping in mind that sometimes, courts, judges, attorneys don't always have your best interests at hand, or don't always realize the reality of the situation, may or may not be narcissists themselves, but typically often have their own agenda. And, so just keep that in mind too. And so any sort of, over emotional reaction could then be penalized against you. I've seen that happen to people. I saw it in my own situation many years ago when I went to get a restraining order from someone, and there was no doubt what happened, but the judge did not at all take my side and refused to even listen to what I had to say. So, I didn't have nearly the training or understanding back then that I have now. My best advice to you is the depersonalization, making it not about you. That way you don't get swept into the defense, the self-defense. I wish you a lot of luck. I know that's got to be really challenging. You also mentioned the flashbacks. The flashbacks, I'm imagining from the past part of your relationship with this person, whether this was like, an intimate relationship or a work relationship or whatever. And, that's the really hard part of the PTSD struggle, are those flashbacks. And I think so many people, including myself, I didn't even recognize all those memories, that like the emotional memories that were bombarding my mind, or just like coming up out of nowhere and just like sabotaging right in the moment when I was trying to do something, or I just couldn't even focus. I didn't even recognize that those are flashbacks. Like, just like a vet, goes to war, comes back, and has flashbacks of the war and the battles that took place. And I didn't realize that, the memories of the fights, the memories of the abuse, that all of that was actually flashbacks too. And so that's the key part of the PTSD, are these flashbacks. And what I try, before I would just kind of let that sweep me away into like a tidal wave. Now what I try to do is just come back to center, really grounded, and then depersonalizing those as well, kind of like trying to watch it like you're watching a movie, so instead of like evoking such a strong emotional response in your body, like viscerally, right, just kind of like popping up into this observer, breathing, right, because that breath is what helps you come back to center. It's what reminds you, it gives you that space to think consciously of what you want to do differently. Pop up into that observer and watch the memory from that observer, rather than being so directly connected to the emotion. Someone else wrote here, privately, today marks 1 year after all the breakups with him in the past from his constant lies, letdowns, etc. I was reflecting earlier before I came on. I have to say, knowing him was the most painful experience of my life. Finally learning and having to accept what he was difficult, and finally believing that I meant nothing to him. He didn't even like me as a human being. I was nothing but an object for his sadistic urges, a toy when he was bored. He loved to build me up with more promises and fake love. I always feel for it, but then he would pull the rug, and he thrived on seeing me upset and crying. I was worn down and in the end terrified for my health because I became unrecognizable, pale, drawn, always two red eyes, and that went on for years. He also loved to press my buttons for the reaction he wanted. I was so manipulated and exhausted from it all, and yet I still loved him. I believed it would stop, that he would finally come to his senses. Also, he used to behave as if he were a single guy. It was so disrespectful to me. Finally, I felt he was cheating also, and I found the evidence, but he still lied about all of that. Now it's a year, and during that time I broke no contact, and I'm glad I did because it confirmed they get worse. Yeah. Sometimes we go back for these lessons, like something is left uncertain or undone, or it's just the hope, often that's left, where we just hope that our love can heal them. We hope that our love will make the situation better. And unfortunately, that's just not the situation with these kinds of abusers. It just doesn't happen that way. They don't change. They aren't responsible to that love. They don't take any personal responsibility for their actions. They don't have remorse for their actions. They feel entitled to treat people that way. They feel entitled to be the exception to the societal rules and agreements that we have of behavior, of interactions amongst one another. And, a person does something one time, okay, maybe it was a mistake. They do it again and again, you know exactly who you're dealing with, right? So now moving forward, all of us, we know, okay, that's what it looked like, right? And it would happen again and again, and we would enable it, meaning we would excuse make or rationalize, stuff it down and keep going. But now, keep hoping for change. But now we know, like, how somebody does something, that's just how they are. They do something 2-3 times, they don't care. They don't care about your interests. They don't care about your feelings. They don't care about your perceptions of reality, your opinions. They're going to keep doing that manipulative behavior. And the only way they keep getting away with it is if we allow them to, if we enable it. So really, we just have to not enable that behavior. And, I totally understand and relate, how upsetting it is that you're talking about, how withdrawn and pale you become. You see photos of people before, during, and after these relationships. It's like the photos of people who go to war before, during, and after. These visible changes on the face, but then look at the photos 6 months later, a year later, of no contact. You see the person starting to come back to life, sometimes faster than others, depending on how quickly people are moving through the process. And everybody moves through that process at a different rate. And, you don't have to put any kind of expectations on yourself, like, well, in X amount of time, I should be feeling this way or feeling that way. It doesn't work that way. And, even like the stages of grief, as they call them, it's not a linear process. It's like all over the place, and you can be moving along, and then you go way back here, and you're up and down and back and forth. And it's just how it works. It's multidimensional. Sometimes it's cyclical too, like, layer upon layer unwinds, and I think, like, as much as we can handle consciously at the time, something comes up, maybe through a flashback, a memory, we're dealing with that. Okay, we process that emotionally, we move beyond that, we apply some forgiveness work, hopefully, to that. Because remember, the forgiveness is not about the other person. It's only about yourself. The forgiveness is what lets it go. It's like lubrication, just letting that off. getting rid of that, and then coming back, and then a month down the line, 2 months down the line, like another flashback, another, emotional thing. Okay. It's another layer, right? And so it's like layer by layer by layer unwinds. And, it could be years and years and years down the future that the flashbacks come back, that, the memories come back. It could be just some random thing. That's just the bizarre thing about PTSD is sometimes, it can go months, years, and then all of a sudden something could be completely seemingly unrelated, but it's not unrelated to the subconscious. The subconscious gets triggered by that, and then something comes up. And be patient with yourself going through this process, because it really does take a lot of patience, to keep going, to trust yourself, to forgive yourself, to keep working on that forgiveness, because the self-forgiveness, that's the hardest part. Sometimes it's easier to forgive the transgressions of another person. Sometimes it's a lot harder for the self-forgiveness, for having stayed, for having seen it, because we all saw it. We saw some red flags. We didn't want to believe them because we wanted to believe the illusion. We wanted to believe the story we were telling ourselves. And so we kept going. We wanted to believe in hope. And so we kept investing, so there's a big layer of self-forgiveness that we all need to do as well. Okay. She says, yes, she was constantly repeating herself. She becomes so negative. She was waiting for the next broken promise, the next lie. I stopped looking forward to anything from him because I felt he would upset me before or after. And sure enough, he never failed not to. Yeah. When you get to those points where it's just, it's broken expectation after the next, after promises and lies, and you just kind of stop counting on the person, but yet we still stayed. We still kept investing, thinking, okay, things will turn around. They're having a rough time. They went through something traumatic, or they have some kind of health issue, or they have some stress at work or some stress in the family. And if I just keep loving and keep investing, everything's going to be okay. But these are really just illusions that, we had subscribed to. And it's liberating when you can look back at that and realize the truth. It's devastating in a way, but at the same time, it's also liberating, because the truth will set you free. Knowing that truth means you don't have to grab on anymore. You don't have to grab on even to the hope anymore that someday in the future, this person will change. They won't. They just won't. And sometimes they move on quickly and they're with somebody else. And, you're like, wow, they were never like that with me. They never did that with me. How can they just do that? How can they love that person, but they couldn't love me? It's all a lie. It's all an illusion. None of that's real. Those people don't change. That's just how they are. It's just how they are. Okay, the person from the earlier message says, thanks, breathe 3 times. I've got a huge number of books on the subject, but not that one, surprisingly. Even studying the subject got to where it would induce a flashback so bad I couldn't keep studying. I think that maybe where some outside coaching might help, but I am so much better since no contact a few years ago. Yeah, good job with the no contact. That's really key. It's the center pin for everything in the recovery, the self-healing, the moving forward in life. That center pin is the no contact, because it is the point of your power. It's the one thing you have control over is your behavior. Your actions, how you react. And if the person tries to contact you and you don't respond, if you don't reach out yourself and try to respond, so much better, because you're keeping that power to yourself, because any interaction is going to lead to a loss, and it could just be a loss of self-esteem today. You made some contact, your self-esteem plummets. Now you got to spend the next several days, maybe weeks, rebuilding your self-esteem from that one little interaction, or that one little peek at the photo with the other person or something, or the nostalgia of like pulling out old photos and stuff. That's why I recommend people get rid of all the paraphernalia, the photos, the text messages. Sometimes people will keep some text messages, like screenshots and whatnot, of the abuse, to remind them later that that was abusive, that, not, because sometimes people still, they want to go back, they want to imagine, well, when that person was good, when that person was kind, when that person was loving. And having, the record of that abuse can be really helpful to remind you, of what that was. But don't keep like all the loving stuff. Don't keep, the love letters the person sent you, photos of them. Purge it all. Make a little ceremony out of it if you want to. If you've got a backyard and a little fire pit or something, throw it all in there. And as you're throwing it in there, like having some sort of, little ritual that you create for yourself that allows you to emotionally release and process that so you can move forward. Also, what you're saying here about sometimes studying would get to that point where it would induce a flashback so bad that you had to stop. That's possible too, especially when there's so much that we've stuffed down and consciously we don't even realize, like we don't even see the tip of the iceberg of just how much we've stuffed down. Like even when we realize, we still haven't totally realized. And that's something that the understanding that I've gained through psychedelic medicine experiences in Peru last year, for example, when there were no conscious filtrations and defense mechanisms, it was all there and it was all present and that feeling was there. And I just thought like, my God, how did I stuff it down? How did I go on living like that? And when you have the flashbacks like that, maybe it's triggered by reading and educating yourself and getting knowledge, the purpose is to process it, right? But it could be overwhelming. And that's why you need to, be patient with yourself and know, okay, that's enough for today. That's enough for right now. Put that aside, work with what's coming up, process that so you can clear that off the cache, clear the cache so that you've got some clear memory now to start working on the next phase of things. And, trying not also to resist it and push it away, because when it's coming up, it's because there's something there to resolve. And just going, no, I don't want to see it. No, I don't want to see it. Like that's where we were when we were in the abuse was, no, I don't want to see it. Let's look over here instead. Let's pretend this is it instead. But in the healing process, it is really key, to allow the things to come up as they will, to be present with them, to breathe with them, to sit with them quietly in contemplation, meditation, just observing, and just seeing what new perspectives you can extract from there, what new understandings you can extract from there, what new lessons you can extract. Because if it's coming up, it's for something. There's something left unresolved. And, the more we allow that to be, the more we're present with that, the less it has to grab at us. Sometimes the psychological things, when they're repressed so much, or the psychology is just so overloaded, all of that energy goes into the body. It becomes somaticized. And so we develop sudden injuries or illnesses or even chronic illnesses over time, just because we're stuffing it down and stuffing it down, and it wreaks havoc. So it's really key to be present with it, not to push it away, to breathe through it. Sometimes in yoga, teachers will talk about leaning into the discomfort. Nobody really wants to lean into the discomfort. Mostly we just want to like push it away and reject it. But, there is something to that. And sometimes, if you're a person, if any of you are people who tend to somaticize the stress, I do, movement, dance, yoga, stretching, for me, this is key to my survival. This is key to my health, is that movement and the stretching. And I love to do it very gently sometimes too, where you literally practice leaning into that discomfort. You gently move yourself to the edge of where you're comfortable, and then you lean ever so gently into that discomfort so that you can be present with it and breathe with it and see what else comes up. And I do encourage people too to write things down. Like, as things are coming up and you're processing, you're meditating, you're having revelations about things. And maybe in the moment, it doesn't seem like some grand, big revelation, but it's in the moment, right? Write it down in the moment, because down the road, it could be a day, it could be a week, it could be a month or longer later, you go back through your little journal that you're processing and you're like, oh, wow, that happened and I felt that, and then this happened and now it totally makes sense. And so it's very validating too for your intuition to go back and see that, and to recognize that, you did have that realization that something, was coming out of that, that you already were starting to tap into some truth there. And that can be really, really helpful too for the emotional processing, because the more we process those emotions and the memories, the less the flashbacks haunt us, the less the flashbacks take control of us, in that initial part of the PTSD where it just seems like it's so out of control, like so overwhelming, just this tidal waves of emotion and energy and memory. And the more we deal with it, the more we lean into it, the more we sit with it, the more we breathe through it, the more we process it, the less it haunts us, and then the body things start going away, because once we start psychologically resolving things, on a holistic level, the body no longer needs to, scream that symptom. Maybe it's like, it's a hand issue. A lot of people get hand issues. Why? Well, the hands are like grasping. Right? So if it's something you can't quite grasp, or if it's something that you're trying so desperately to grasp onto and hold on to, you can develop hand issues. The body is very symbolic in that way. So you'll notice a big difference too. Like the more you discharge all of that emotion, the healthier your body starts to recover, the healthier body feels, the energy you get back. And I really do recommend, if you're a person who gets the somatic stress, to do some extra movement, some extra stretching, maybe some yoga, qigong, something like this. It's really helpful to, sometimes we can just get so caught up in the mind, so doing something with your body just kind of like brings you back into your body versus like just floating around out here, ungrounded, unhinged, which is where we all were at some point during the relationship, and where all those flashbacks and emotional charges can take us afterward, long afterward. So doing things with your body is just really helpful for bringing yourself back to grounding, back to center, fully present in your body, and reminding yourself that you're safe in this body, in this vehicle. Let me get caught up here. Okay, so someone else says, he also loves to poke and taunt when I'm trying to get on with my life. He now knows he can't affect me anymore. He knows his cheating and disgusting porn was the final straw, and I'm actually able to go to bed at night now and sleep and wake feeling refreshed. I'm much happier now, and things are starting to fall into place. I got rid of everything. He means nothing to me. Yes, I would love to burn him in a nice little bonfire. Yeah. Yeah. So you got to the point where you realized so fully and clearly what was going on that he realized that you knew that the game was over. The gig was up. There was no more. He wasn't going to be able to get away with anything anymore. And so he disappears. And that's sometimes a blessing when they just go away. They realize like you're on to them. You don't want anything to do with them. You're not going to fall for the hoovering. You're not going to fall for the pity. You're not going to fall for any of that. And, like you said too, you're actually sleeping better now. So many of us going through these abusive situations, we get to the point where, we become sleep deprived, can't sleep at night, not sleeping restfully at night, even long after that person is no longer sharing a bed with you, it even could be someone at work, or just a friend, a platonic friend that's causing, this kind of abuse in your life. And it's causing you to lose sleep. It's causing you not to sleep well, to have insomnia. That's when you know something's not right, when you're not sleeping well, and so this is good. I'm really glad to hear that you're sleeping well now. You're waking, feeling refreshed, oops, the chat just moved. and you're in a happier place and things are falling into place, yeah, that's when that's a sign that your self-esteem is increasing, right? So your self-esteem is how you esteem yourself, right? And I think that where this comes from is we come up with this self-esteem based on our interactions with reality, our interactions with other people, with life in general. So if things are going well and we feel positive interactions with people, we feel like our efforts in life are returning, we work and there's reward for it, or, we do certain good deeds and there's reward for it, or whatever, that kind of thing leads to a high self-esteem. When you're in a relationship that's abusive, why do victims have crashed self-esteem? Is because you're engaging with this abusive person and your efforts are for naught. Your interactions with this person are just making you feel worse about yourself. Everything that you're doing has no reward, like no return. You end up feeling like you're crazy. You feel guilty and ashamed for having thoughts or beliefs or emotions or opinions or perceptions of reality. And that person's like, no, that didn't happen. No, that's not what's happening. No, you're this and that. And so, your self-esteem just goes down and down and down because you're not having positive feedback from reality, from the universe, right? So moving past that, after the relationship, redeveloping self-esteem is about taking new actions, because when you take new actions, you get new results, right? Because we do the same old thing, we're going to get the same old results. That was Einstein, right? Like the definition of insanity is keep doing the same things and expecting something different. So if we do something different, we get new results. And then it's like, oh, wow, that's awesome. Look at that. So we're getting positive new feedback from the universe, and it starts to build the self-esteem. So that's really wonderful. And then, how do you know your self-esteem is improving? You feel good about yourself. You feel good about going out and doing something because you know that you're going to have, some sort of positive result from that, whatever that might be. And, you're feeling better about yourself because the efforts that you're making are having some kind of return versus, when you were in an abusive relationship and you were having like a negative ROI on your investments. Let's see here. Okay, someone says, the funny thing was that going no contact got turned into me abandoning this person in court proceedings. And yes, I do go back to keep studying when I calm down eventually. I sincerely believe the whole experience will help others eventually. And yes, somatic issues got serious and the physical recovery became as big as the spiritual, emotional, heart murmur, and high blood pressure. Personally, the most interesting discovery was that I found out why both my parents committed suicide, who drove who to what, and how I had been groomed for toxic relationships. Even though I've been in various forms of ministry for 45 years, what I advocated for others was not what I did personally. In the end, this has been very fascinating. It really is, isn't it? It's like we realize the things, what it does, like why did we have this relationship afterward? Like we're all asking, like, what was that for? Why? Right? And it's because it's helping us resolve something, learn something, and you're talking about what psychology calls the original wounds, right? Like those that came from childhood. And, if you were raised by a narcissist or manipulative person, maybe there was one codependent and one narcissistic person, could be bipolar, could be sociopath, doesn't matter, somewhere on that cluster B, or even just a manipulative person who doesn't necessarily fulfill those requirements. But when you're raised in that, it just like you said, groomed for toxic relationships, because when you're a child and you're witnessing your mom and dad or your primary caretakers, whomever they are, you're installing a blueprint, of what is love, what is a relationship, how does one treat another, and how should one be treated by another, and what does it feel like to be in a relationship. And so, children internalize that. And a lot of times, we don't give kids credit for being so perceptive. Sometimes people say, oh, I just got to stick it out for the kids, got to stay in this horrible toxic marriage for the kids. But sometimes that's just a much worse disservice to the kids, because the kids are growing up in this world where they're accepting that as normal, and then they go off into the adult world, and then they attract more toxic people. It doesn't have to just be romantically. It could be at work, with bosses, with coworkers, could be neighbors, could be friendships, and those of us who are raised in it, we're the ones typically who are just surrounded by them. Like when we finally realize what's going on and start really taking inventory of the people in our lives, it's like, wow, how many toxic people did we let in simply because it felt normal, and that is fascinating, like you said, like so fascinating. And like I had similar situation where I was doing holistic work, I was doing massage and body work and acupressure and now coaching. And I was helping people resolve a lot of the same issues that I still hadn't resolved in myself. Like I didn't know what narcissistic abuse was. I didn't get it. And now that I know, it's a whole different thing, and sometimes the most obvious thing is just like, we can't see it because it's right in front of us. And once you see it, it's so enlightening because, like reading the book Psychopath Free, for example, by Jackson Mackenzie, so many people, including myself, read that book and it was like, wow, my whole life just made sense now. It's like all the pattern, you can see the big picture pattern and all the little pieces all fitting together. It all makes sense now. Or maybe you happen to find a therapist who really gets it, like who understands what narcissistic abuse is, who understands what manipulative, people do, the tactics that they use. They have personal experience with these kinds of people. They didn't just read it in a textbook, because you can't really get it if you're reading it in a textbook. It just doesn't make sense. It's not real. It becomes real when you experience it. So, if you happen to meet that therapist who gets it, who's gone through that, and supports you and points out these things and help, to guide you towards some insight and stuff, that can just be so enlightening and alleviating, because it's like this huge weight just comes off of you, that burden, the guilt, right? Because those of us who are what Dr. Simon calls neurotic, right, which is the opposite of the character disturbed, the neurotic is characterized by the guilt. The character disturbed has no guilt. The manipulator has no guilt for what they do. We take on the guilt. We take on the blame. We take on the blame for everything in that relationship. And all the negative feelings of that person just got projected onto us, and we internalized it. And in that heavy, enormous weight, and when you realize like you're holding on to this weight of something that isn't even yours, and you just set that free again to the universe, it's so lightening. It's incredible. Sometimes you just feel like your rib cage, your diaphragm can expand so much wider when you're breathing. Someone says here, I had all of that in the beginning and during the years, but once I learned everything, I knew I was done. He never hoovered. I'm good these days. Yeah. Once you figured it out, he knew there was no more point, and once you figure it out, that is usually when the person stops hoovering. And the only dangerous thing with calling the person out is, you don't want to still be in the relationship, still living with the person when you call them out for who they are, because that could turn very, very dangerous. After you get out of the situation, if that person is still hoovering, and you're texting or whatever, and you're letting them on, maybe you didn't realize about no contact yet, and you're letting on that, what they're doing, you know who they are. Once they see that, they're going to run away. Now, you don't want to push that too hard, because they could be mounting the smear campaign. They could be recruiting flying monkeys. That could go really bad, which is why it's usually better not to have the direct confrontation. But in a way, it can be good that they know that you're on to them, because that will make them back off. They don't want to be exposed. It's like, it's the one thing that they care about, and the one thing you could pretty much count on. The narcissist does not want to be found out. The sociopath does not want to be found out. The sociopath is the most covert, and the sociopath wants to be able, to pull the wool over the eyes of a lot of people in society. So it matters very, very, very much to them, the public perception. So, they definitely don't want you out there, exposing them for who they are. So they'll likely run away. True, that's him. Yeah. So, that's good. He's backed off. He's not hoovering. Sometimes people will continue to hoover until they get it, that you get it. You know, if they think there's still a shred of a chance of hope that you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, that you're going to, you know, forget what happened and go back for more, or that they can seduce you, you know, again, either sexually or with flattery or with affection. I love you. I miss you, blah, blah, blah. If they think there's a shred of hope, they're going to keep trying. You know, if you just cut it all off and you get it, they know it, they're not going to come back for more. That will stop the hoovering, because they're going to move on to someone who's a lot easier. They are looking for the easy prey. They're looking for the low hanging fruit, you know, and so they're looking for someone who's going to make it easy. They don't want a big challenge. They certainly don't want to, you know, someone who's going to potentially expose them for who they are and ruin, you know, everything that they were planning on doing. Oops. Everything you need to know. Whoa, Siri, that was not for you. Someone says here, my biggest regret is that I spent the best 20 years of my life married to an abuser and then 10 more years trying to get a divorce. He passed on 6 months ago. I discovered narcissistic abuse personality types 3 months ago and am finally on my road to recovery. I applied the no contact rule and suppressed all the negative feelings over the years. Hard work, even the person is no longer. Right. Right. Because, you know, in your case, he died, you know, and still haunting you. You know, the remnants of the relationship, all of that stuff, it's like, it's still haunting. Just because this person is out of our lives, they might even be out of this planet, no longer existing in human form, and still haunting, you know, because of the memory. And, you know, the mind cannot tell the difference between what we're imagining, what we're remembering, and what's really happening. So when we have these memories, these flashbacks, you know, these emotional memories, it's like we're reliving it completely. Like physiologically, we're reliving it because the mind cannot tell the difference. So the body is reacting as if it were actually happening, you know, and so even death, like even beyond death, narcissists can be haunting us. That's why we have to do the inner work, you know, because it all comes back to that inner work. It really has nothing to do with that person. Even the forgiveness work, nothing to do with that person. It's all about us, you know, it's about liberating ourselves from that. Yeah. And having applied the no contact rule, as you said too, that's really, really the key. Someone writes here, any way is good for those who do not know where to go. I had set very accurately which way to go, and I think people should seek emotional balance and seek to free themselves from their anxieties and insecurity. The future exists for those who know where to go. Right. So, you know, the anxieties and the insecurities that are left over from these kinds of abuses, right? And that's a huge part of the recovery. You know, the anxiety is part of the PTSD, you know, and that can grow over time if it's not dealt with. And it's sort of like this gnawing fear of something that you can't quite put your finger on. You know, it could just be the fear of the future. It could just be the fear of it happening again. You know, it could be the fear of running into that person, you know, but those anxieties can be paralyzing. And the insecurity as well, you know, that insecurity might not have existed before the relationship. That insecurity might be a result of the relationship. It might be that it was so much beating down and beating down and beating down that, you know, self-esteem went down and the person became so insecure, right? Insecure maybe of their physical body. You know, if your partner is telling you that you're fat, if your partner is telling you that you're unattractive, if your partner is telling you that your breasts aren't big enough or your dick isn't big enough or whatever the issue is, you know, or that you're not smart enough or that, you know, you're not good enough. And good people do, you know, forgive others, you know, which is the way of spiritual abuse, you know, but if you're a spiritual person and you're like, well, yeah, I'll just keep forgiving. I'll just keep forgiving. And the person keeps abusing and keeps abusing. You know, you're becoming very insecure. Your self-esteem is going down. Maybe you develop jealousies that you didn't have before because of the triangulation, you know, because they're constantly comparing you with other people, and you're feeling insecure about your physical body, about your intelligence, about your spiritual kindness and goodness. And you can feel so insecure. So that's really key. You know, that's a good suggestion that you made. Really, really key to the recovery is to working on the anxieties and the insecurities, you know, and that's work that you can do for yourself. You don't have to depend on anyone else for that. You don't have to depend on anyone, you know, admitting accountability for their actions or having remorse for their actions or telling you that they're sorry. You don't have to worry about any of that. You can do that for yourself, you know, and it is work and it takes time, especially the anxiety, you know. The anxiety might be a lifetime thing. You know, I think it gets better for sure. You know, I look back and I see my anxiety was really, really bad in the past. I still have it, you know, it's not nearly as bad, but it's still there, you know, and there's specific things that trigger it, especially like social anxiety. Like if I go out in public, you know, at a bar or a restaurant or something, I'm much more anxious. I can feel it in my body. My body is like tense. You know, the words that I'm saying, it sounds anxious. I'm stuttering more. You know, maybe even my mouth gets really dry, like as if I just stood up to give like a speech somewhere. The anxiety might come on to each person, you know, in specific individual ways, but noticing your patterns is really key too. And when you notice it and you recognize it and call it out for what it is, it's almost like it takes the power away from it. Because like when I'm out in public this weekend, I noticed I was sitting out in public and there was a lot of people, and you know, I noticed the anxiety come on, and I was like, okay, so this is the anxiety part. This is me going through that anxiety thing. Okay, let's breathe. And as I was breathing, you know, my temperature dropped. It wasn't sweating as much. You know, I wasn't stuttering as much. I was coming back down. My body, I was like breathing. My body was relaxing more. It's almost like you take the power away from that anxiety, away from the insecurity when you acknowledge it to yourself. You know, maybe you're, you know, this new person you're dating is talking about someone else, and maybe you notice it triggers an insecurity, you know, and so if you call it out to yourself and you're like, oh, there's that insecurity. I'm feeling insecure about this. Why would that be? Oh yeah, because in the past there was that situation and I learned, you know, this, and so I became a little more jealous. Now that's not really me. I don't really want to have those feelings. That's an insecurity. How can we work with that today? And asking yourself, you know, empowering questions. So what can I do about that now? You know, that's really helpful. What action can I take right now to overcome this insecurity? You know, or maybe you're in public and the anxiety comes on and you're like, okay, this is the anxiety part. What action could I take right now? What small little thing could I do right now to make this better? I could breathe. Wow, I could breathe, right? You can always breathe. One of my teachers taught me that. Siempre puede respirar 3 veces. You can always breathe 3 times. And so just coming back to the breath, even something as simple as that, maybe you can do nothing else but breathe. So breathe. Someone else wrote here, the pain, we would have saved ourselves had we known about narcopaths before we met them. Yeah, true that. True that. But can't change the past, right? Past happened as it was. You know, we don't want to get stuck on the regret of, oh, if only I hadn't done this and that. If only this and that. Can't change it. Can't do anything about that. So what can we do now moving forward is recognizing it, seeing it really clearly, so clearly, understanding it so well that if it shows up again, we're going to recognize it. We're going to be like, no, that's not right. That doesn't feel right because I've been through that, you know? And on top of that, on top of the growing awareness of these patterns in people, because there are millions and millions of people with these kinds of character disturbances, and they're everywhere in society. They are around the world. It's not any kind of socioeconomic class or cultural thing. It's everywhere. It's an epidemic, a pandemic. But being able to recognize the lessons as well, because for each person individually and uniquely, there's something there for you to learn, something to learn about yourself, not just like, oh, there is evil in the world and this happens. That's part of it, but there's more than that. There's something really positive there. There's some treasure to extract from the trauma, taking that trauma and transmuting it into something beautiful, into something that gives you more purpose in life, into something that sparks a new curiosity, that sends you researching and studying and learning and adventuring around the world, anything, right? Every person, I believe after these experiences has something to extract from there, some kind of beautiful lesson, and not just a lesson of, okay, I have shitty boundaries, I need better boundaries, I need, to this, that, not just that heavy stuff, but something beautiful too. And one survivor who I think is also a therapist, she runs a YouTube channel called Show Boundaries. She's really great. I love her a lot. And in one of her videos, she said, learn to use it so it cannot use you. And I think that is so beautiful, because if you get out of this and you recognize there's something in there that you can use, maybe it becomes a new passion, maybe it becomes a new career direction, which is what I did with it. Maybe it just becomes some kind of creative thing for you. Like maybe you write a blog about it. Maybe you make a film about it. Maybe you start making a video blog about it. Maybe you do whatever with it. Maybe you find some new creative thing with it. Or maybe it's just some little thing that you do, but it's actually a big thing because it's a creative process for you. It doesn't have to change the world. Putting into that creativity and seeing the result of that for you and just you alone is already worth it. So being able to find those things, those little gems, little treasures hidden inside the trauma is really key, because when we can use it in that way, it doesn't suck us dry anymore. It doesn't bring us down into just the heavy negative stuff. We can turn it into something beautiful to move forward. Someone says here, asks, is there a difference between mindfulness and meditation? I just followed your recommendation to meditate. It may be just the same, correct? I got a book called Mindfulness for Dummies, and I'm going to read it to learn more about mindfulness. I am a newbie. Thanks, Meredith. I'll have to listen to your response on the YouTube later because I'm having problems with the audio. I can see you. I just installed the Zoom today and learning how to use it. Tech problem in my end. My apologies. I'm so sorry. I know sometimes it's challenging with the tech at first just to figure everything out. I get really stressed with technology sometimes too. It will get a little easier week after week. It's always going to be like the same format. So it'll be the same week after week. Hope maybe if it's just your device, sometimes I have to just restart my device and then it fixes and it clears the bugs. I've also heard from some people who are trying to use a tablet, like an iPad. For some reason, sometimes the audio gives them trouble. I don't know why. Maybe it's in the settings or something. But regarding the mindfulness and meditation, so they really do go hand in hand. So mindfulness is a meditation in that it's being present with the moment, with the here and now, Nikanashka, as they say in Nawal, one of my teachers. And so being fully present in the here and now, meaning when you're in the kitchen and you're cooking, you're not thinking about all the things that happened that day, or this really emotional conversation you had with someone, or all the things you need to do tomorrow. When you're cutting vegetables, you're just cutting vegetables. When you're sweeping the floor, you're just sweeping the floor. Being so fully present in what you're doing that your mind is not distracted, because wherever your attention goes is where your energy goes. So if your attention is going to that person, to that situation, to that memory, all of your attention and your energy is going there. And so you're not present here. Right. And so you're missing things, you could be missing out on the beauty. You could also be missing out on things like red flags, right? Like when we're sitting with a new person, we're on a date, a new person, long after this healing thing. And we're trying to figure out, okay, is this a good person or not? Do I want to hang out with this person? And if all we're thinking about is like, for with this person, they're talking and we're just like, we're so intensely like imagining ourselves with them in the future? What would it look like if we had babies together? Or what if we got married? Or like, what if this and that? Where is all the energy and attention going? Somewhere else, some kind of fantasy, some kind of thing that's not really real in here. And then that thing gets superimposed on top of here. And then we start looking at this person and but we're seeing the illusion. We're not really seeing the person. So putting all that away and just being present with this person, remembering to breathe, because breath is so key to meditation, to mindfulness, coming back here and now, centered, grounded in your body, fully present, right? And when you're fully present and mindful, you notice little things like the person's making eye contact with you in a healthy way, not like in the psychopathic way where they're just like studying to see, you know, everything, but they're making gentle eye contact and they're looking away, you know, now and then, you know, maybe noticing their body language, maybe definitely noticing how you're feeling, you know? So instead of just like trying to win over this person's approval where all your energy and attention is going to that, you know, focusing on how do you feel in this moment? You're having this conversation, you're fully present in this conversation. How do you feel in your body? Is there any feeling happening in your body? Do you notice anything? You know, is your stomach a little tingly? Do you get chills every now and then? Do you feel really heavy and tired? You know, noticing those little things, because the more mindful you are, the more present you are, the more you will notice what's there. And the thing is that people will always paint themselves. One of my teachers taught me that too. La gente misma se pinta. People will paint themselves as they are if we let them. If we let them and we don't superimpose our own beliefs, our own desires, our own illusions and fantasies on top of them, being fully present, you know, and then being fully present with yourself. You know, so when you're taking a walk or you're cleaning the house or you're doing whatever, being so fully present that you're in tune with yourself. And this is key for redeveloping the self-trust moving forward, because during these narcissistic abusive relationships, you really get into the self-doubt, like major self-doubt and confusion. And that becomes very difficult afterward to rebuild. One of the best ways to do that is the mindfulness, the meditation, you know, and sitting with it and with yourself and being fully present and recognizing that your intuition is always communicating with you. It's just that sometimes we don't listen to it. Sometimes we stuff it down or we rationalize it. And the rationalization, you know, it's a great gift that we human beings have, the ability to rationalize. It can also, you know, it's power and responsibility. It can also be a downfall if that rationalization is used as excuse making, as enabling in a relationship or in a situation where you're like, you know, I'm here with this person, this new person, and gosh, you know, everything looks really great. I'm getting this really weird feeling in my body. I don't really like that feeling, but it's probably nothing because what they're saying sounds perfect. I really like what they're saying and blah, blah, blah. And so we rationalize, you know, it sounds good on the surface. And we rationalize the feelings, you know, that we're having in our intuition, and we're ignoring the intuition. And that's not good. So you want to be really present, really mindful with yourself. And the more mindful you are, the more you notice these things. And the more you notice and then take action based on that, the more you strengthen your self-trust. And so, you know, you asked about the difference between mindfulness and meditation. Meditation simply being the formal practice of sitting, maybe laying down, but sitting and just being present in the here and now. And, you know, a lot of people think that, well, they can't meditate or they're really bad at meditating because they have all this stuff in their mind. Welcome to the club. You know, everybody has like 10,000 things running through your mind. That's the whole point of meditation, is to practice, you know, sitting with it and allowing it be without being disturbed by it. So, you know, sometimes I've heard teachers talk about imagining your thoughts as clouds passing through the sky, or like in the fall when the leaves start to fall off the trees, you know, and they just kind of like fall down to the ground, and just detach yourself from those thoughts, you know, and just like as an observer, watch them go by. They're going to go by. And so the point of meditation isn't to resist it, to be like, stop thinking. It's not going to work that way. So let it go by, but don't get invested in the thought. Because typically what happens when we're not mindful and not meditating is we get a thought, the thought triggers an emotion, And then that triggers this whole response, right? The physiological response, the mental response, you can start going down that path, versus the thought comes by and we're like, oh, okay, there it goes, and what you'll notice is that there's particular thoughts that repeat over and over. It could be thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, insecure thoughts, could be fearful thoughts, could be anxious thoughts, could be whatever. But what's really great is when you notice patterns, you notice keys, like, that keeps coming up. Well, there must be something there. What's there? And then that allows it to kind of open up again. And some people like to try different techniques for meditation. There's so many different techniques. If you go online, you can read about a lot of different ways. Some people like to, light a candle and focus on looking at the candle. It gives your mind something to focus on. Some people like that. Some people like to have their eyes closed and just focus on the breath. So for me, that's my favorite kind of meditation, is focusing on the breath. Because the breath is always there. You could be standing in a line somewhere waiting your turn, and you don't need anything fancy. You could just focus on your breath while you're standing there. Don't do this driving. It could be dangerous, but when you're in a safe situation, especially when you're waiting on things, like waiting in line, or maybe you're on the phone waiting on customer service, use that idle time to meditate. And what you'll notice is that certain things keep coming up. And when you're mindful, you'll recognize that those things are coming up and that certain patterns are coming up. And the more and more you meditate and the more you practice this, the less of a bombardment of thoughts you'll have, the less you'll have. It's like nobody has this like perfect mind. Anybody who tells you they have this perfectly blank mind and nothing goes through, they're full of shit. That's not the human mind they're talking about. That's going to happen. And so, I think sometimes that discourages people, and they think they have to be like perfect and they have to have this empty mind. It's not like that. It's really a process. It's a cultivating of that state of being fully present, and noticing what's coming up. And I really do recommend keeping a journal of the things you notice, because it could be really validating for your self-trust. To be able to look back later in that journal and see, well, that came up in a meditation, and that came up too, or that came up, when I was just being mindful, and this was coming up, and wow, isn't that funny? Because this thing just happened. So it's really validating. I really recommend that. And you got that book too. That sounds great. I haven't read that, Mindfulness for Dummies. Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know if you've heard of this Vietnamese monk. He's got a bunch of books out. What's the best one? Something about mindfulness, Art of Mindfulness. Oh, I can't see it in my stack over there right now. If you look up ThichNhathanh, maybe is how you spell it. If you Google that or look on Amazon, The Art of Mindfulness, these kinds of books that he writes, these are really great for understanding a little more about that. And I hope that the technology stuff gets figured out so you can hear a little better. Someone else says here, the dealing with anxiety, etc., both personally and for others, seems to have become something of a high value calling. Just meeting someone that is aware of this whole realm is like running into family. I think I understand what you're saying. I'm not entirely certain. Are you saying that it's like, when you meet other people who are recognizing these patterns of anxiety and whatnot, that it's like we're all family, that we know what it's like to be going through this? Is that what you're saying? Okay, I'm going to wait for your response. I'm not sure exactly what you meant by that, but you can clarify that if you like. Someone else wrote here, I have these thoughts of sharing my healing experience with others. However, I feel somewhat ambivalent about this, as I do not wish to make the abuser's problem my crusade. Yeah, it doesn't have to be your life calling to go out and share, your experience with others. It could be that you extract something else from this, something unique that then you use in a different way, but still something valuable that you learned through those experiences. So yeah, I mean, you don't have to be the person who's out talking about this exact thing. Do you know what I mean? Like this exact, the awareness of this kind of abuse and, always talking about this person and his influence in your life. You definitely don't have to be doing that. I do encourage you to look for the treasure though. There's something there for you and for you uniquely and for you individually that you can extract from your own personal experience. I do believe we all have, the opportunity to extract something wonderful from that, that can lead us into something more in life, because, they say everything happens for a reason. And I do believe that. I don't believe that it just happened because the person was a jerk and this and that. Like there must be something there, something valuable for us to learn, or our soul perhaps wouldn't have chosen that learning experience. I do believe that at some level, our souls choose the experiences that we want to have in this life to learn something, because why else are we here in human form but to learn, to have this experience of separation, this experience of me being separate from you, this moment of lesson, to come into this reality and have these experiences and then merge back with the unity and all that is later, the experience of individuality that we have here, the paradox of being both separate and together, united as one at the same time. There's something there. There's something there for everyone, I believe, to learn. Okay, so the person clarifies here. Yes, for instance, a couple weekends ago at a conference, I met a lady that had emerged from an NPD marriage, and it was surprising how instantly we were on the same page. It was simple but significant. It really is. When you meet other people who have gone through it and they know what they've gone through, like they found the keywords, they went to Google, somehow they figured out about narcissism, NPD, narcissistic abuse. You have that conversation with a total stranger, and it's almost like you've known each other a really long time. Like you're like, oh my God, you get me. Like, what that was, because really only someone else who went through one of these experiences can get it, can totally get it. Even though they had a totally different experience, the patterns are just almost predictable. So similar, from culture to culture, from country to country, from high socioeconomic status to low socioeconomic status, the patterns across the board are so very similar, and that's why too, I think it's not worth so much energy trying to figure out exactly what condition that person had, whether they were an NPD or a BPD or an ASPD or, a histrionic. Doesn't really matter. The point is they had these patterns. The effect on the target, the effect on the survivor is almost exactly the same, the confusion, the self-doubt, the brain fog, the memory problems, the plummeting self-esteem, the worthlessness, all of that. It's across the board. And, it didn't matter if your abuser was a narcissist or a sociopath or a borderline. It was almost an identical experience. There are probably nuances, in the behavior of that person, but very similar manipulative strategies. And that's what, Dr. George Simon talks about in Sheep's Clothing, are those tactics, the covert, aggressive, manipulative tactics that they all use. And the joke is that, so many people write me and they're like, oh my God, it's like you're talking about my marriage, or you're talking about, my mother, or you're talking about whatever. And it's like as if everybody read the same book. It's like as if all these abusers read the same book, how to do this kind of manipulation, what to say, what to do. It's uncanny how similar it is. And it's just, and I was talking to a therapist actually on Friday. We were laughing about this, and, we were speculating like how that happens. And, I said, well, maybe it's just that, that we learn this, in our environments growing up. Like if a kid learns from his parents, this is how you manipulate, and the kid can go one of two directions. Maybe the kid goes the codependent direction, no boundaries, letting people take advantage, or maybe the kid goes in the narcissistic direction and learns those manipulative strategies and employs them for survival versus, appeasing the abuser for survival, which is what the codependent does. So the kid just learns that these are the terms of human engagement. This is how humans interact. If you want to get what you want, you manipulate in this way. You use guilt, you use triangulation, you evade the truth, you give, you omit big parts of the truth, and you only give little parts of the truth. I think it's taught. I think these behaviors are taught, and I think that's why it's so important, moving forward, that we stand up individually. It starts with the individual. It is an epidemic around the world. How do you even stop that? One person at a time. That's you standing up and saying, it happened to me and it ends with me. I'm not carrying this legacy of abuse forward in my family. I'm not passing it on to the next generation. I'm not passing it on to my next lovers and relationships. I'm not passing it on to my friendships and my coworkers. I'm ending it now. It ends with me. And, as more and more and more and more of us stand up and have these realizations and take new action and end the legacy of abuse, it spreads as well, and that's how we end this legacy of abuse. That's how we end the epidemic. I think trying to affect massive change on the societal level is very difficult. It has to start with the individual. I think that's what Confucius got right when he talked about starting with the individual. The individual gets right, the family gets right, the society gets right. And right now we're in just a total breakdown of society and family and interpersonal relationships. So I truly believe that the power starts with the individual. Let's see here. Someone says, yes, anxiety is a topical social phenomenon. Yeah, lots of anxiety. Dr. George Simon also talks about, major anxiety being a characteristic of the so-called neurotic. Those of us who are not character disturbed, like manipulators, we develop a lot of anxiety. Sometimes some character disturbed people have some anxiety. Typically more, I think, the BPDs, the borderlines. But I think that, predominantly that anxiety is seen amongst those of us who have been victims, those of us who are survivors, and it's so common in society, incredibly common, people having anxiety issues. And even you turn on a television, you watch the news, just that can give someone a panic attack, an utter anxiety attack, because just fear, coming off the television. And, that's where we're at in society. We're at this stage. And so, turning that off, not paying attention to that, opting out, it's like going no contact with the abusive person, going no contact with the broadcasting, going no contact with the news bombardment, getting your news online, articles and things if you want to see things, but sitting in front of that TV can be just incredibly damaging, especially if you're prone to anxiety. And, sometimes if we've repressed the anxiety, sometimes we're not even aware that we are anxious, or we're not even aware sometimes of the triggers and things that make us more anxious. And then, sometimes we have coping mechanisms, could be an addiction. Sometimes people are drawn to narcissistic abuse as an addiction because of the anxiety, because it's familiar to have that kind of anxiety, the up, the down, the up, the down, the up, the down, idealization, devaluation, and then going back and forth between, the guilt of everything and then the fear. The guilt, it's all your fault, you're the entire one to blame, and then the fear. When everything is going good, you're afraid that things are going to go bad again, because they do. It's constantly up and down. And the anxiety of that cycle, being in that cycle and knowing that when you're on one end, it's going to get flipped, and it's going to keep getting flipped back and forth because it's one big cycle, the abuse cycle. Someone says here, what has become interesting to me beyond identifying the cluster B are the common good traits of former victims. They would make some kind of wonderful army, no? Yeah. The good traits of the victims. I don't know if you're familiar with Sandra L. Brown. I forget the name of her institute. It's a very long name, but she did studies on thousands of victims of psychopaths, and she identified 26 super traits that she noticed across the board in the victims, such as hyper empathy, high investment in relationships, forgiveness, tolerance, these kinds of good traits. These are good human traits. It's just that they can be exploited by people like psychopaths, like narcissists, because that's exactly the trait that they want to be able to manipulate. They know if you're really tolerant, you're going to keep putting up with it. They know if you're really empathic, they just have to tell a sob story. They have to tell a pity story, poor me. And then you're going to feel empathic for them and their condition. And then you're going to overlook, so those same traits that pre-qualified us as victims also are the same traits that can help us heal. And that was one of the most powerful things I got from Sandra L. Brown in one of her interviews. I can't remember the person she interviews with, but if you look her up on YouTube, you'll find the interview. It's in like multiple segments. Really great insight on that, utilizing those same traits that got us into the mess for our healing. They're not negative traits. They're not things that we need to change about ourselves. It's just that we need to be more discerning with who we share those traits with, versus just openly extending, that kind of tolerance, turning the cheek over and over and over again and just keep getting beat around. No, if somebody does it 2 times, that's who they are. Like, they have proven themselves. They haven't changed. They're repeating their behavior. It's who they are. There's no more need to be tolerant at that point. And it's confusing because if you're a person who has a high value on tolerance, and then the abuser is like, oh, you're a horrible Christian, or you're a horrible spiritual. You say you're spiritual. You're not spiritual at all because, you're not forgiving me. And so they twist that. And that's what's really tricky. And you have to get to that point of discernment and realize, no, not everyone deserves your blind tolerance and your blind trust, because people will abuse that. They'll take advantage of it. Case in point. So you give people a couple chances, maybe even 3 chances. After 3 chances, that's done. There's no more reason to hope and expect anything different to happen, because the person is proving who they are. No more need to be tolerant of them. No more need to be tolerant of that behavior. That's when you set the boundary real clear. Here's the new boundary. This isn't going to happen again. Here's the boundary. Here's how I want to be treated. Can you treat me like that? Because if not, goodbye. And then, of course, if that's a toxic person, they're going to try to get you to feel guilty and ashamed for setting the boundary. And that's your proof. That's when you know it's a toxic person. Get that person out of your life. Don't let them around you. Don't let them in your life at all. That person is never going to respect your boundaries. They're always going to abuse your positive qualities. So knowing who to share those qualities with, really key for moving forward. Someone says here, one of the primary reasons for leaving their dad was because I did not wish for marital abuse to become my daughter's normal. Yeah, that was wonderful. That you realized you were able to think beyond yourself to the next generation, and realizing you didn't want your daughters to grow up thinking that if a man treated them like that, or a woman treated them like that, that it was normal and acceptable because their mother, put up with that, or that's how their father was, and then it was okay at home. And so you set an example. You set a powerful example by leaving. By saying, I'm done with this. I don't want this anymore. This is not for me. That was a powerful example to your daughters. And hopefully they notice that, hopefully that's, something that they're going to take forward with them in their lives, and recognize that if they're attracting toxic, manipulative people, it's because of that, because of observing their father growing up and how he treated them and how he treated you. And they're probably still going to have some issues with it. It's almost unavoidable. Those of us who grew up with that, even if the parents split up, if we spent significant time, with a certain parent who was the toxic parent, even just beyond the early ages of life, when the ego is formed, between 0 and 7, particularly between 2 and 7, when the ego is formed, after that is when the person is really going to need a lot of therapy, working through things. And no doubt, as you heal yourself, your daughters are going to pick up on that. They're going to notice, that you're changing. Things are changing about you. Mom has a whole new level of self-respect now. That's interesting. Let's learn a little bit about that. Let's observe. Mom's interesting how mom handles that, and then they'll notice that in themselves. And it's sort of like, you're providing them that mirror where they can look into that mirror and see themselves and see where they're at and decide, do they want to upgrade their self-respect? Do they want to upgrade their self-esteem? You know, do they want to upgrade their perspectives about their father or about someone else in their life, you know, or about relationships in general? So you set a very positive example by leaving, by standing up for yourself. Someone says here, yes, I have stood up to him and the others over the years, but somehow I'm supposed to be the crazy one for not entertaining their bullshit. I burned those bridges, and I'm glad I won't tolerate people like that in my life anymore. I've also noticed they disappear for years without a word or an apology. Then when they are visiting, they expect to be entertained. Let's all have a tea party as if nothing ever happened, but I'm supposed to be the crazy one. Yeah, they love to make the other person the crazy one. They love to tell you that you're crazy. And these are crazy making behaviors. That's why they call it crazy making. It will drive you to the point of insanity. You can lose total grip of your sanity staying in these relationships, you know, especially the gaslighting, because the gaslighting just corrodes your perception of reality. And when your perception of reality corrodes and you no longer know what's real and what's not, that's a very dangerous place to be. And we all were there at some point, doubting our own sanity, you know, and then, you know, how they provoke you in public in front of other people, but so covertly that other people don't realize, you know, what's going on. And then if you react, you look like the crazy one, or you look like the bad one, or you look like the abusive one, worst yet, you know, which is why you don't want to be around them in public. You don't want to defend yourself in public. You don't want to deal with them in public, you know, confront them on anything that's not going to go well. They're always going to want to win that. And they don't stop. When they want to win, they have to win. They don't let anybody else win. The whole game is for them to win, for them to get what they want. Yeah, and you said you burned those bridges, and that's good, because I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it to people who haven't heard it before. There are some bridges that you have to burn so that you don't go back, you know, because if that bridge is still there and you think you cut it all off, right, and you moved on, someday down the road, you could get to this weak point where you consider going back across that bridge. You consider reopening the contact, going back to the old way of being. And that's why you got to burn those bridges, so you have to move forward. There's only one way, and that's forward. There's no more going back over that bridge. You know, I think there's a lot of pressure sometimes in society, like, oh, don't burn any bridges. But, you know, that just doesn't apply to some situations, especially abusive situations. Burn the bridge, throw the grenade, torch that thing so that you can't go back. Someone says here, and they are good at making everybody else believe that you're the baddie. Yes, they are. They really are. And that's why you don't want to get into the public confrontation, you know, and that's why, like, a big key to the whole smear campaign, you know, the tendency is to want to defend yourself, to get caught in self-defense, because when someone is attacking your character, you want to stand up for yourself. You want to defend yourself. And that can just be so dangerous, you know, especially if they've recruited multiple people and they've already filled their minds with bullshit. And now they're already seeing you in a very warped way. And so if you react to what they're doing in a very predictive way, in the way that they know you're going to react, you're only feeding the fire. You're only giving them what they want. You know, you're making yourself look bad. And it's just better to walk away, you know, and you can't convince people. If people don't see it, they're just not going to see it. It could just be they're totally ignorant. It could just be that they're other codependents, you know, and they can't see their own predicaments, so they can't see yours. It could also be that they're very toxic people and they get off on that and they enjoy that, you know, like the narcs gathering together and feeding off of one another. It could be any of those scenarios, and it doesn't matter which it is, you know, and even if you know that they're not narcissists and that they're codependents, you know, and the temptation is, well, let me just tell them my side of the story and then they'll believe me. And no, don't even do it. If they wanted to believe you, they would believe you. You know, if they wanted to see the truth, they would see the truth. If they wanted to talk to you about it and recognize what you've been through, they would talk to you about it. You know, nothing really good is going to come from that. It's better just to walk away. And I know that's really painful. Sometimes you have like mutual friends, mutual acquaintances, you know, or even like their family members that you got close with over a long relationship. But unfortunately, that's just part of the collateral damage to these relationships, you know, and it's too dangerous to keep those doors open, because if you keep a door open to someone who's still in contact with them, there could be information going back and forth. That person could be manipulating them, even if that person doesn't, you know, genuinely want to hurt you or to give them information that could hurt you. They might not know. They might just get caught up in the manipulation, not recognize it, and that could come back to you too. Someone says here, I suffered from identity erosion during my ex-narc relationship. It has taken me several months to recover slowly to know who I was before I entered in the insanity. I'm listening to your audio series and it's helping me a lot. Thanks a bunch for that. You're welcome. Yeah, that 12-week series, the Sana series that I made, that is my way of overcoming this. You know, every episode I go into another layer of unfolding the self-healing journey. And, you know, I wanted to make that available for people because I think it's so key. Every one of those areas was so key for me to heal, you know, to work on my healing, to work on the recovery, to get beyond it, because it's like, it's not just like one thing, it's so many things, like your whole life. Like you're talking about identity erosion, your whole sense of self gets destroyed in one of these relationships. You know, victims, survivors will leave these relationships often not even knowing who they are anymore, like losing total sense of their values, you know, your sets of values. Like maybe you had values, you knew what your values were going into that relationship, but that person, like, you know, worked and corroded at that and even convinced you to take actions against your values, to compromise your personal integrity, because your personal integrity is your values and your actions. Are they in alignment? Are you taking actions in alignment with your values, or are your values over here and you're taking action over here? You're out of integrity. And so what the narc will often do is, you know, through triangulation, through subtle coercion, through grooming tactics, they'll get you to take actions that go against your values. You know, they'll get you to cut out people in your life who are important, who love you and support you. They'll get you to do things that you would never do, make horrible decisions. And then later, what happens? You feel like shit about yourself. So now the abuser taught you to abuse yourself. You know, you start taking actions that you would not take normally, and then you feel horrible because you did it. You can't even blame them. Like, yeah, they encourage you to do it, but you took the action, right? So you blame yourself, and then you got to forgive yourself and realize, like, that's not something you want to do. That's not an action you would normally take. Recognize that that person helped, you know, to groom and corrode your sense of self, your value system, and then having to redefine those values. You know, what's important to you? What do you believe in? What do you value? What's meaningful? And how are you going to protect those with powerful boundaries? You know, understanding these are my values and I'm going to protect these. And if someone enters my life and they're trying to convince me that my values aren't worth protecting, or there's something wrong with me protecting my values, adios, because I'm not entertaining that anymore. I'm not getting involved in that anymore, because that's the clever way that the abuser gets you to abuse yourself. And then later, you know, your self-esteem feels so crappy. Your self-worth is so crappy, not just from what that person said and did to you, but from what you did, or from how you feel about yourself because of what you did. So really key moving forward, coming back to yourself, realizing who you are, redefining yourself. You know, maybe you like to eat pizza and nachos on Friday nights in your underwear. So what? That's your life. And if somebody else had a problem with that, that's their problem, you know, and that's not like a big value thing. That's just something that you enjoy doing. So what? You know, so allow yourself in the recovery the time to do that, you know, the time to do those things that you love, the things that are important to you. It doesn't have to be meaningful to the world. It doesn't have to be important to someone else. That doesn't matter. What matters is it's important to you, is part of who you are, and is part of your identity, your sense of self. So taking actions and allowing yourself the time, the space the permission. Give yourself permission, because when you're in the relationship, we all transferred our sense of approval to the abuser. It was like we're waiting for permission to do this or that. We're waiting for permission to feel good, to feel this or that. And we're always looking for that exterior approval. So turning that back inward, that sense of approval inward, the sense of validation inward, the sense of permission inward. You and only you give yourself permission. Of course, not hurting someone else. You don't want to hurt someone else. This isn't the audience that I'm speaking to, I don't think I have to preface that. I think you guys know that, but I just want to say that because sometimes people will twist that around, but when you're hurting someone, when you're not hurting someone, and taking those actions to redefine your sense of self. It sounds selfish to be focusing on yourself, but that's okay, because there has to be a balance in life between selfish and selfless. And if you have too much of one or the other, you're at the extreme ends. Too much selfishness, you're narcissistic. Too much selflessness, you are codependent. You are the martyr. You're living your life for other people. You're going to be miserable, right? So you got to find the middle ground. And if you've been entirely too selfish, you're going to have to be more selfish. Allow yourself time to do that. Allow yourself space to do that. Allow yourself permission to be yourself, to redefine yourself. Exactly. It's a journey like you described. It's trying to remember who I was that has healed me before entering it. I am becoming aware of how important that is. Yeah. And I think sometimes too, well, always basically, you get out of this relationship, PTSD in general, people who went to war, went through any kind of traumatic experience, what we all say is nothing will ever be the same. And it won't. Life will never be the same as it was before that traumatic experience. But that doesn't have to be a horrible thing, because, it can be much better, because maybe your sense of self before the relationship wasn't so clear. Maybe you weren't so clear about what was important to you and what you wanted, or maybe you weren't taking such, purposeful action toward what mattered to you. Something like this, right? And so after this experience, now you have this renewed understanding of who you are. You have this opportunity to redefine yourself, to take the good things from who you were in the past, and then to extract something beneficial, learning experience from that trauma, and then to create something new, something beautiful, something powerful from that, the empowerment of moving forward. Someone says, the values are protected by the actions of people, and they bring the limits of a relationship. Correct. The limits, the boundaries of the relationship. Yeah. And your boundaries, your actions protect your values, right? And so if you're in a relationship or any kind of interpersonal, communication with someone, and they're trying to corrode your values, you got to set that boundary immediately. When someone is trying to convince you that, what you believe isn't good enough, or what you're doing isn't good enough, and you should do things, a different way, you got to check in with yourself. If they're trying to manipulate you, you got to set that boundary and realize, no, I'm going to defend that. I'm not going to do what you want to do just because you want me to do it on a whim. That gets really complicated in work environments when it's regarding work, when it's regarding, like your boss or your coworker is like telling you to do some kind of work, and like your job is dependent on that. And, the unfortunate thing about that is, like, at some point you got to leave. Like, you got to get your resume fixed up. You got to start applying covertly for new jobs. You don't tell anybody what you're doing. You sneak that, you find another job, you get that job, you give your boss the minimum amount of time, maybe it's 2 weeks notice you have to give, whatever the contract says, you give them the minimum amount of time, because that time that's left after you tell them you're leaving, all hell is going to break loose, because they have nothing left to lose. If you're in a romantic relationship, you're living with a person, maybe it's not even romantic, maybe it's platonic, maybe you're roommates, you're flatmates, and this is going on, and you realize you got to go. You got to get your new place lined up. You got to give that person the minimum amount of time that your contract, your lease, whatever allows for. And then your guard has to be all up. If it's just a romantic relationship, I would just sneak away. I would just sneak away, not tell them, disappear while they're at work, while they're on vacation, while they're out and away and they have no idea, and they come back and you're gone and all your things are gone. And don't take their things, don't mess around with them. Take what's yours and take what's yours, because that is yours. But get out and get out covertly, because having that confrontation could be really, really dangerous. So, the less you have to do that in a work environment, it's usually more complicated because you have the contracts and you're risking your career reputation and everything, and you can stay in it for a while and you can practice your boundaries and you can practice standing up for yourself and you can practice all of these deflection, techniques for the manipulation, but that person's never going to change. And, at some point it usually gets to the point where you got to get out because there's just nothing left there for you. Good. Someone says here, I find my healing process a very lonely place to be because I do not want to discuss my therapy with friends, those whom I would normally share with. Yeah, it can be really lonely, and that's why support groups are wonderful, whether they're online or in person, because when people have been through it, they get it. They know what it's like. You can talk about it. You can bitch about it. You can laugh about it. You can cry about it. You can say one little thing and the person gets it. Like they get the whole picture. You say this little thing and they're like, I know, I went through that, right? Where if you talk to somebody who's never been through it, it's just, they can't get it. They can't understand it. It's inconceivable because it's so crazy that people just can't imagine other people would treat people like that. And it could be very lonely moving forward. It could be, it could be difficult dating and moving forward because you're getting to meet this new person and you want to share parts of yourself with this person. You don't want to share too much at the beginning, but it comes up eventually. It comes up. And, and how to deal with that and how to manage that, if that person doesn't know what it is, if that person has never been in that kind of situation, if they haven't, that's awesome. That means you found a healthy person. That's great. If it's another codependent who's healing, maybe they get it. They went through it and they're also healing like you. And they're like, I know I used to do this, but now this. That's awesome. You have someone to really talk to, but if they don't get it, it can feel really lonely. And, you want to be a little cautious with what you're sharing, just because you could look crazy, you could look like you're a toxic person because they just don't get it. So selective sharing at first, you don't have to put it all out there, but yeah, it can be lonely. That's why, you really want to get in contact with some support groups, for that reason, so you don't feel so alone. And a therapist too, like you found a therapist, that's great. You're talking about discussing your therapy. Sometimes people haven't found a therapist who gets it yet. I really recommend finding someone, because being able to talk with a professional who gets it can be so helpful, because they can see some things, they can point out some things maybe you hadn't seen, they can point, out some obstacles that you're still running into. They can point out some steps that you can take to start moving forward and get yourself out of there. That can be really, really helpful. Someone says here, privately, yes, I think this is an opportunity to learn more about myself. Exactly. Someone else says, one thing I noticed lately is that it is important to take the opportunity to do something new if it's legitimate, to help make a new existence. New things do come. Life can get really good despite the dark and negative left over from the cluster B encounter. Thanks for the encouragement to see new. It started to get left out over time. Yeah. New things do come. That is the amazing thing about life, is everything in this universe is in a constant state of change, right? So yeah, nothing will ever be the same, and nothing will ever be the same, right? So things are constantly changing. Life is constantly changing. And it might seem like there's some situations that don't change, but there is change. If you look for change, if you take new actions, you see new results, you get new results, you put yourself out there in a new way, you connect with people in a new way, you find new activities, you start doing new passions, new curiosities that you had. Maybe since you were a kid, you always wanted to sing. And maybe your mom, made fun of you when you were a kid and you were singing, and she told you, you can't sing, you have a horrible voice, you're just like me, and then maybe you never sang. You know, maybe you're just like, you were so self-conscious of your voice that you never sang, not even in the shower, in the car, because you couldn't let yourself go because all you heard was your mom's voice, you know? And now you're like 45 or 65 and you really want to sing so good, you know, get on YouTube and learn from some people. If you can afford it, get a singing teacher, you know, take some courses in singing, practice singing. Like, it doesn't matter if you're good. You don't have to like win awards. You don't have to be a professional. You don't have to be entertaining people, you know, at events, singing, you know, out in public. It could just be for you. And that's okay, you know. So finding those new creativity things, those new endeavors in life, that's just for you. It's not necessarily for anybody else. It's not necessarily because it's going to be a new career or a new thing that you have to do out in public. Maybe it's just in the shower, but that singing just feels so free. You know, the throat is like the truth, like the throat chakra is about truth. It's about speaking your truth. And when we don't speak our truth, when we stuff away our feelings because we were taught to do that, we develop issues. Like, I notice I'm like, like always clearing my throat a lot. I still have some issues there. You know, there's still some truths that I haven't spoken about the abuse in my family. And I expect that as I do that, this is going to go away. You know, and sometimes we get like a sudden throat problem, maybe like soreness or like strep throat or something like that, usually something to do with the truth factor. And so singing is everything to do with this. So when you start singing, you're speaking your truth, even though you're not just necessarily speaking your truth, but you're singing. You're saying, I have the right to sing. I have the right to express myself. You know, this is self-expression here. And self-expression is who you choose to be, how you identify yourself in the world. So you want to give yourself permission to do that. You don't have to be really good. You know, you don't have to be the best. It's just for you. It's for your enjoyment. Someone says, oh, good advice. Thanks. Exactly. Now dating to me is scary. Yeah, it can be. It can be. I just started putting myself out there a little more, and I'm not finding it scary. I'm finding I'm picking up on it pretty quickly. Like, I'll get messages from people and I'll like, oh, there it is, real quickly. And then just those get weeded out real quickly. And it's funny, you know, people coming from like the womanizing aspect of it, or people coming from like the ultra spiritual aspect. You know, it's really interesting to see because it plays across the board all over the place. You know, trust your intuition moving forward. And like I was mentioning, I think in response to your question earlier too, you know, say you go on a date with a new person, you know, instead of like thinking so much or imagining so much, right, about who this person is or where this is going to go or what could happen, just be fully present in the here and now, fully present in your body and feeling your body and your intuition. And like, how do you feel when you're with this person? So this is where, you know, I'm bringing myself every date, you know, every interaction, every text message I get from someone, I'm reminding myself, how do I feel right now? I feel pretty good. I feel pretty uplifted. I feel pretty positive. I'm not obsessing positive, right? Because that was a negative sign. You know, like we didn't recognize often at the beginning the idealization as a negative thing because it felt so positive. It was a lot of flattery. It was positive attention, but it was over the top. It was too intensive. And then I noticed I became too obsessive. I was just like obsessing about the text, or I was obsessively thinking about the person, right? That's also a negative sign, even though it appears positive. If I feel calm about it, I feel like that's a good sign. You know, I'm not obsessing about it. I'm not questioning about it. I'm not like over analyzing. When I get to that point, I know something's not right. You know, even if I can't put my finger on it, that's okay. I know it's a sign that's not right. If I'm sitting there and I feel like my energy is pretty lively, I feel pretty good, I know things are pretty good with the interaction in that moment with that person, you know, and allowing things to develop slowly over time, not rushing too much, and allowing people to reveal their character over time, because people can put on a facade, you know, but there'll be little things that get through. Maybe it's just a certain way they worded something, but, you know, not getting too caught up in the words, even though sometimes people often people do use words that give away some of the subconscious things that they're actually feeling and thinking or planning, but typically it's their actions. So notice the actions even more than the words, you know, notice the body cues, notice the way the person is treating you, Notice how you feel when you're with that person. Notice when you go home, what happens. Are you exhausted and it's so tired you can't keep your eyes open? Not a good sign. That person drained you. They sucked you dry. Maybe they were just talking, or whatever, and it was just really exhausting. Or if you feel pretty good, pretty clear, probably a good sign. Or do you go home and you can't focus on anything because all you're thinking about is that person and everything that happened. You can't wait to see them again. Probably not a good sign. It probably means you're too much in to that already. And you want to take a big step back and be more observant. And just allow people to reveal themselves. They will reveal themselves. That's one thing you can count on. People will reveal themselves if you allow them to. If you don't superimpose what you want to see, people will reveal themselves. And it's usually within a short period of time, especially if it's at the beginning and you haven't invested too much in that person. If they figure out quickly that they're not going to be able to get past you with those manipulative behaviors, they're going to move on to the next victim who's going to be a lot easier. They're not going to try to cultivate a victim who's being really difficult. They're not usually interested in that. Sometimes you get really sadistic people who see somebody who's very confident and self-assured and maybe even successful or something, and they specifically set out to destroy that. That's a different situation. That's usually when you're dealing with a sociopath or sometimes even a psychopath. But the typical, narcissistic, borderline type of behavior, they're usually looking for an easy victim. So, if you don't get pulled into that, you don't get overly, and wowed by them, that's a good thing. You don't want to get pulled in too much. Allow people to reveal themselves and trust your intuition. Trust how you feel. Trust if you leave or you had a phone call and later you just keep thinking about something they said or a question they asked, there's something there. Write it down because you don't want to forget that. There's something there. Something didn't sit right with you about that. Maybe it's not clear yet, but it will be clear. So notice those things. The things that keep coming up, it means something's there. That I recognize that about my intuition. So I would be rehashing conversations, or I would keep hearing someone's voice saying something. It means there's something there left unresolved, something not quite right. But really, really start to trust yourself. You have to go now. Okay, thank you for joining us. No worries. I am going to wrap this up pretty soon because it's been pretty long. Let's see here. Someone says singing or dancing, great idea. Yeah. I love both of these, singing and dancing, and expressing yourself, expressing your creativity. Again, you don't have to be good. And when you're doing this home alone, you don't have to be good. No one's judging you. Dance party of one, singing performance for you in the mirror or just out in the ethers, right? Just for you. And you don't have to be good. It's about the experience. It's about enjoying it. And if you are enjoying it, that's all that matters, and keeping the diary to fine tune my intuition, like you recommended, good. That will be really valuable for your sense of validation, for your sense of self-trust, for your intuition and trusting your intuition, because your intuition is always right. It only goes wrong when you ignore it. It only goes wrong when you rationalize why the intuition was wrong or why it could have been wrong or why maybe this or that. That's where the trouble comes in. So always trust your intuition. Sometimes you never get proof. But you can pretty much guarantee that if you act on that intuition, you escaped, a situation that could have been worse. Maybe you never get proof that it would have been worse. But if you act against that intuition, it's not going to go well. It's not going to go well. If any, maybe you escape without harm, but still what you're sending is the message to your intuition that it's invaluable, that it doesn't matter, that you're not going to listen to it anyway. So your intuition gets quieter and quieter, and it becomes harder and harder to discern. And so, I like to describe the intuition as a friend. And sometimes that friend is that friend that, like when you're always giving advice to someone and they're just not taking your advice, and you just stop giving them advice because it's exhausting and they're not using it. So why bother? Sometimes the intuition works like that. It's constantly telling you and you're not listening to it. So it's not as loud. It's not as clear because you're not listening to it. But the more you take action for your intuition, the more you validate yourself, the more you trust yourself, the more clear that channel with your intuition will be. The intuition is like the immune system that can protect us from the external viruses. An analogy, I think. I like that. I haven't looked at it that way before, but I really like that. That's excellent. Like the T cells, maybe, the T cells of the immune system dash in there and take over some kind of attack, some kind of foreign invader. That's a really great analogy. I like that. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Yeah. So trust the intuition. Self-trust is really key. Got to rebuild the self-trust. A big part of that self-trust is speaking your truth. Speaking your truth, acknowledging that it was abuse, it happened, and now you're healing yourself from it. I have to work on it a lot. Yeah, we all do when we get out of these relationships. And you will see results, I guarantee. You will see positive results. The more you take action in that, you will see positive results. You will see your self-esteem rise. You'll notice that, how different you feel. Your close friends and family might even notice that, how different you're acting now, because they were probably the first ones who recognized the identity erosion. Like, you're just not yourself. Like, something's off. I don't know what it is. And they'll be the first people to notice when you're coming back around again, and you've got that self-esteem again, you're trusting yourself again. And you'll notice it too, because decisions become easier. Like, if you're like always indecisive, you're afraid to commit, another sign of self-doubt, right? So the more self-trust you have, the easier decisions are. You don't have to like go back and forth so much. You just know, okay, I'm going to make this decision. I'm going to buy this thing at the grocery store. I'm going to do this. And you just do it without thinking about it as much. It becomes a lot easier. It doesn't have to be as complicated. And then that just frees up a lot of energy, that you could be investing somewhere else in some kind of creative endeavor. And that creativity really being great for moving forward. I just read a great book. I think I've got my computer sitting on it right now. It's called Big Magic. Elizabeth Gilbert, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love. I loved that book, Big Magic. It's really great. It's about your relationship with your creativity and the whole force of inspiration. And what is it? I really recommend it. A cousin of mine sent that to me, and I read that this weekend. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because we've been going about, almost 2 hours now. I'm going to process the video of this and then load it onto YouTube. Thank you all so much for participating, for sharing your questions, your comments, your struggles. It's really valuable for other people who are tuning in later too and hearing about it, because so many of us have gone through very similar situations. Someone says, exactly, I will make it a habit from now on to improve my intuition. Thanks a lot. You're welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you all. And I will see you soon. Have a wonderful day or evening, wherever you are in the world.